Hey everyone, thanks for joining me in the 9th installment of the Inside JABA Series, which also is session 170 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I'm joined today by Drs. Claire St. Peter, Jeff Tiger, and many-time guest Dr. Derek Reed. Unfortunately, the editor-in-chief, Dr. Linda LeBlanc, was not able to join us today, but she did choose some very cool articles for us to talk about. And these included Vedia and Armstrong 2021, Surface Electromyography and Gamification, Translational Research to Advance Physical Rehabilitation. We also talked about Gravina et al. 2021, Increasing Adherence to a Standardized Rounding Procedure in 2 Hospital Inpatient Units. And the reason why Derek was on board for this particular episode is that he served as the action editor for these 2 papers, and we actually find out what action editors do. And while we did review these papers, we went really deep into the inner workings of the JABA review process, which even if you don't publish research or conduct research, at least personally, I found it really, really fascinating. And in this part of the podcast, we talked about what qualities an action editor looks for in selecting manuscript reviewers and how reviewers become, quote unquote, known for specific areas of expertise. Again, it's kind of like seeing how the sausage is made. And again, for me, I found that stuff pretty interesting. And while we didn't solve the mystery of why reviewer number 2 is consistently a pain in the neck, we did talk about considerations of when to publish in JABA and when to look towards other scientific outlets. This was also really interesting, getting these guys' points of view on this. This led to a lot of unexpected but nonetheless fascinating discussion of how to disseminate one's research outside of mainstream behavior analytic journals. If you don't listen to any other part of this episode, please, I really want you to check that section out. There's some different perspectives about dissemination that I think you'll find interesting. As always, the Inside JABA Series podcasts are presented without sponsors, though I would encourage listeners to consider subscribing to JABA. And when you compare the cost of subscribing to JABA to other journals, it's relatively inexpensive. And it's really inexpensive when you consider the number of papers that a typical JABA issue contains. When I first started subscribing to JABA in the 90s, I think that the thickness of the issues were about a fifth of the size of those published currently. I mean, it's like getting a textbook every quarter. It really is. The volume of research is quite significant. So if you think this is something you're interested in, go to the show notes for this episode, and I'll have links to where you could find how to subscribe to JABA. One other thing I'd like to mention is that these Inside JABA episodes are eligible for BACB continuing education credits through the Behavioral Observations CEU store. So you can go to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEUs to see all the Inside JABA Series podcasts we have, along with other CEU events available. This one should be available for CEUs. I'll finish some of the production for that in the coming days. So if it's not there when you go to check it out, just bear with me. I'll try to get to it as quickly as I can. And what's even better is that because so much of this episode focused on dissemination, this one will qualify for an ethics-related CEU. As a matter of fact, one and a half CEUs to be specific. And that's code element 6.02 for those playing along at home. All right, if I could just beg of you one final indulgence. If you're enjoying the Behavioral Observations podcast, if you like the content that we produce here, do me a favor and share some of your favorite episodes with friends and colleagues. Post it on your social media platform of choice. I'd really, really appreciate that. It helps get the word out. And I think that's pretty much it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to the Inside JABA Series installment number 9.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, I'm joined by doctors Claire St. Peter, Jeff Tiger, and multiple behavioral observations guest, Dr. Derek Reed. Welcome, guys. This is Inside JABA number 9. We are not joined by the editor-in-chief, Dr. Linda LeBlanc, today. She has so we don't really have much in the way of adult supervision today. So we'll manage. We'll attempt to manage nonetheless. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining me today. So even though Linda's not here, she's here in spirit because she asked us to cover a couple of papers here that she tasked you, Derek, to be the associate editor on, or acting editor. I don't know. You guys can clean up my language if it's not accurate. But anyway, so a couple of really interesting papers. You guys were kind enough to share them with me ahead of time, and I read them with interest. So that the two papers that we'll be centering our discussion around are Gravina et al. Increasing adherence to a standard rounding procedure in 2 hospital inpatient units, and Vaidya and Armshaw, surface electromyography and gamification, translational research to advance physical rehabilitation. A really, really interesting study too. So both really very different studies in their own way, and we'll talk about the, I guess, similarities and differences between them. And I think that's going to be the context again for our discussion today. So before we hit record, we're trying to figure out how to actually lead this discussion. And in many respects, I wish I was recording during that time because we were kind of going over how we might tackle these 2 papers and perhaps why Linda assigned these 2 papers to us and so on. But I think what I'd like to do is maybe start with you, Derek, to maybe give us a quick rundown of both of these papers, and then we can maybe get into some of the more, interesting aspects of each of them, and we can take it from there. How's that sound?
That works for me. So I handled both of these papers as the translational action editor, associate editor for JABA, and typically, translational research can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think that's something we'll touch on later. And I think part of the reason I was assigned these is that they're outside the box a little bit. And that's what I really love to discuss and handle and write about myself in my own research. So Linda, was very astute in assigning these to me because I loved both of these papers. And before I get into both of them, I will say in my decision letters on each of them, I think I made a comment that these were like textbook examples of what I think are either an applied study in the case of Gravina et al., like in terms of when I think of applied behavior analysis, this hits all the check marks for me. And then the Vaidya and Armshaw, like to me, this was, again, like a textbook translational study that should be published in JABA. And so it was exciting to handle these at the same time. And so I'll start by just talking about the Vedia and Armstrong one. And so this was a study on surface electromyography and gamification. And so the general idea here was to expand on this idea that behavioral contingencies can help with health behavior. So they get into this discussion of osteoarthritis. So this is something I have no background or experience in, but it's basically how cartilage will degenerate around your knee. And so there's this surgery you can do that replaces the muscles in the joints of your knee, total knee arthroplasty. And one of the issues with that, though, is that, in the behaviors leading up to that, as well as upon surgery, it's very painful to move your knee. And so that could create a punishment contingency that prevents you from moving your knee. And then it causes further atrophy and you can't recover from the surgery. And so the behavior analysts on this study thought creatively and took a technology that existed, something called FlexDot. And it's this little device that can measure electrical impulses in your muscles. And what they are able to do is measure how much muscle is being used in knee movements. So they applied a gamification sort of thing to that with a convenient sample of undergraduates. So this is a proof of concept paper. And they basically show that you could use within subject design to measure how these muscles are moving. And you can also put contingencies on this and see that you could actually increase the amount of contraction that people are exhibiting. So that sets the stage for applied research down the road, as well as research from the medical community. So the other study, again, healthcare setting, it's Gravina and Slyman. And this was looking at standardized bedside rounds. And so bedside rounds, if you've ever watched like TV shows about doctors, you've seen these. So physicians and nurses will gather around bedside of patients and discuss course of treatment, how things are going, things like that. And so best practice is to create a standardized checklist. And so they go through the checklist and make sure they cover all of their bases. But it turns out, just like we know in a lot of OBM performance management, people aren't very good at doing what they're supposed to do. So fidelity is pretty low. And that can have, problematic outcomes where it increases the length of a hospital stay. It can decrease the success of recovery and so forth. So this has major implications. So they applied a common technique in OBM, which is the performance diagnostic checklist, to figure out what the barriers might be to why physicians and nurses aren't necessarily following the standardized checklist. So they apply a treatment based on that, which involves task clarification. It involves going over the rationale for why we do this work, and it also involves feedback. And so we can get into the details of that later. But essentially, they showed that they could increase adherence to the checklist. Not perfectly, but better than in baseline. And the other thing that was really neat with this that I had discussed with the authors is the use of something called simulation modeling analysis, which I'd love to talk through a little bit later on as well. And so this provides a statistical approach to looking at single case design data. And so for this paper in particular, this could have implications for healthcare and people in the medical community reading it. And so being able to put some statistics onto the data and getting that magical p-value that other scientists want to see, that can increase the impact of this paper. And so I thought that was a really nice inclusion as well. So that's my quick synopsis of those two.
When you get these kind of under the dome type papers in, what some considerations might be for looking at, who might review these papers? Is it, so if you're put, I know we don't have the editor in chief here, but if you put your editor in chief hat on, and you're, trying to select people, what are the considerations? I know we speculated how you got some of these papers and, before we recorded and whatnot. So, and if you guys maybe could talk about the types of papers you're seeing coming your way that may be different from the typical ASD DD population. So I guess it's a two-part question. One is, what are the considerations about selecting reviewers to review some of these things in different settings or translational preparations and whatnot, and also what do you guys see in terms of it's okay if you want to speculate or provide anecdotal observations here, but what are you seeing to the extent to which there is a change in the types of papers you're seeing crossing your desk?
If I can get started, then I'd love to hear what Claire and Jeff have to say about their approach. But for the papers I typically get assigned, they're usually under the dome, as you said, Matt, and it's kind of applying behavior analysis to just broad issues of societal importance. So a lot of times these studies don't use the actual participants that would be getting the treatment down the road once this is in practice. So a lot of times it's simulated where it's college students or convenient samples. But it is difficult to find reviewers because I want to make sure these papers get a fair shake. And so I usually look for someone who's a strong methodologist using whatever it is that is being employed in the study. And then also try to find someone who has an outside the box sort of approach to behavior analysis, and people who have experience basically working with non-behavior analysts are often good for tackling these sorts of papers because there's nuance to that. Like these aren't going to always be like precise single case design because it doesn't really lend itself to that if it's an applied setting, kind of like the Gravina and Slyman. And having behavior analysts who have tried to kind of bridge that gap in their own practice or in their own research and working with non-behavior analysts is important so that they get a fair look at why these procedures were employed in this sort of translational approach. And so I usually look for at least two people to fit either of those. And then a third person usually will bring in just to kind of round out something. If it's like a specific area of interest, like healthcare, try to find someone who's had some experience with that. So that's kind of been my approach with what I've done, but I'm really curious to hear how Claire and Jeff have handled that in their own work.
My approach is really similar to Derek. So I think that, like Derek, I tend to get a lot of under the dome papers. And the reason that Derek and I probably get a lot of those papers is we do a lot of that work, right? So each of us, our primary lines of research are outside of the areas of autism or developmental disabilities. And so when people submit a paper, the editor tries to find an associate editor who's got some background in translational research, if it's a translational paper, or in the particular area that the paper is addressing. And so although if you were to sample just the papers that came across my desk and Derek's desk, you might go like, oh my gosh, there's no research happening in autism anymore. That is definitely not true. It's just a function of who we are and the kind of work that we do. But I thought that Derek's description of how he's selecting reviewers comports so nicely with what I do as well. So I try to find a good methodologist who's got a background in that area. I try to find a person who has expertise in that particular area. And then if it's a study that I think has immediate implications, I try to find somebody who can give it a shake on those implications too, right? So would this port the way that the authors say that it would port? Because a lot of our translational research, particularly the work that's published in JABA, we want to know, like, how does this translate in some way? And so sometimes you are having to make speculation about how this is going to work. And we want that to be reasonable speculation that fodders those next studies that are conducted with a population who needs the services. And so it's a little bit of a step beyond the bounds of the data, but you don't want to make giant leaps beyond the bounds of your data in ways that someone might take the paper and read it out of context. But Jeff, how about you? Because you handle some things that are non-traditional.
Yeah, the eclectic mix of papers I've got assigned over the years is always kind of, I always kind of ask the question, like, I wonder why they chose me for this one. But we'll go with it. I do want to say I'm always one that has been really excited about and really valued atypical applications and the expansion, potentially of the reach of what behavior analysis can do. But I always want to be careful in that discussion of in no way ever denigrating the work that people are doing in autism and developmental disabilities. And I feel like sometimes I've heard that presented in a way of like, oh, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be trying to expand behavior analysis. And I think every single person who's dedicated their lives to serving an individual with disabilities or their families, really just to take a moment just to celebrate the challenges that they're taking on for people who truly, truly need them, while also celebrating those who are applying their efforts and our science to new areas, that they're all incredibly important. And I'm grateful for every single person who's doing those things. In terms of selecting reviewers for these kind of out-of-the-box papers, obviously you're looking for somebody with some familiarity. Certainly as it relates to translational research, there are definitely biases among people in terms of what the mission of JABA in particular should be. Is I think for most of us, we recognize that behavior analytic research, all research, but behavior analytic research lies on a spectrum, from basic all the way to applied. And no study is 100% one or the other. Don Baer wrote a wonderful paper, I want to say in 1976, that like all applied research is basic. It's all generality testing of basic principles and applying it to new situations. But somewhere on that spectrum line is a cutoff of what would be most appropriate for JABA and what might be more appropriate for, JAB or behavioral processes or other more basic oriented journals. So, one of the things Derek said was trying to make sure a paper gets a fair shake is trying to be cognizant of knowing people and where their biases lie and where papers should fall along that spectrum and where their needle falls, and making sure that you're getting at least a sample of people who, value some things that might fall a little bit more towards the middle than others. And I've often tried, you want people with expertise in that area, but I've also tried to generally get somebody without any expertise in that area to make sure that it's written in a way that can communicate to that outside person. Is that sometimes we can get so technical with our language that nobody outside of that box can understand what it is. So I always appreciate the perspective of somebody completely who's gets a paper, like I said, like, I have no idea why I'm getting this one. I want at least one reviewer to have that reaction on any paper I handle.
Jeff, you stole my follow-up question. I was going to ask that very thing. Is there a case to be made for selecting a reviewer who doesn't know anything about the particular topic? And I think you've perhaps made that. I don't know if Claire and Derek, you guys have thoughts about that too, that you'd like to add.
So the methodologist that I referenced is often that content area novice. So they might know a whole lot about this particular kind of experimental design or this particular control procedure generally, but not necessarily about this content area. And so they have this ability to serve multiple functions on the review panel in a really nice way.
And I would add that there are instances where I will intentionally pick someone who I know disagrees with this line of work, not usually as like one of the core, two people that you're asking, because then you're going to get a split, but maybe as like a third or fourth reviewer, depending on the topic, to bring someone in. And so two topics that I handle a lot are things including self-report or hypothetical behavior. So a lot of behavioral economics is in that realm, or the use of statistics to analyze data instead of single case design. And so I've got go-to people who I know take a hard stance against either of those two approaches. And I just know from my own work that I'm pretty sure they were reviewers for me at one point, but it pushes you to be a better scholar, and it pushes you to better sell those ideas in your introduction. And so getting those comments and kind of forcing a conversation between the authors and then that reviewer, like in terms of how they revise their paper, will often make a much better paper. And so that's often intentional. It's probably very frustrating to authors, but ultimately it does make a better paper.
And there's kind of different jobs that need to be accomplished with a paper. It's like somebody needs to be able to evaluate methodology. Somebody needs to be able to evaluate novelty or advancement or contributions to a field. Somebody needs to evaluate how well it communicates. And sometimes one person can do multiple of those jobs, and sometimes it's one person for each. So the mix is very much like, how many roles can one reviewer hold? And that opens up the freedom to get somebody to be very outside the box. So it's when we used to use 5 reviewers for a paper, it was way easier. We're now, for efficiency's sake and saving everybody's time, it's more commonly to have 3 reviewers for a paper. Everybody needs to be a little bit more thorough in their thought processes, and it's definitely made the selecting of reviewers a little bit more challenging with a smaller team to work with.
Can I'd love to just this again. I think these kind of behind the curtain or behind the scenes, practices are fascinating, at least to me. Is it fair to say that the selection of these reviewers is not systematized, meaning that you're going off what you feel someone knows, or obviously there's someone's published work that's probably the most clear source of data, but are there any other guidelines that you use to because I'm thinking, like, are these I guess reviewers are that are strong in this area or that area, are these reputational factors that I'm just trying to think about how someone gets categorized as X, Y, or Z. And if you guys have a better framing for my question, feel free to voice it. But it just seems very kind of like, I don't know. I think clubby or chummy, those are too pejorative, I think, in terms of valence, but it's kind of where I'm going with this. So I don't know if you guys are able to speak to that at all, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So in some respect, it is based on reputation, and it's based on someone's own, published, just body of literature. Like this is what they're known for. So therefore they would probably be the best person to handle this. But in terms of like showing behind the curtains a little bit, so in the portals where we as AEs can select reviewers, people's names are associated with different like keywords. And so we could do a search and find someone with self-reported expertise in an area. So occasionally, like once a year, the journal might prompt people to go in and update their keywords. If we're adding a new reviewer into the system because they're not already in the system as a reviewer, we can put that in and we can assign keywords to them so that other AEs can then find them. And so that is an opportunity that exists. The other thing I'll add, and I don't know how other people feel about this, but this will be my hot take. Authors have the right to also recommend reviewers. It doesn't mean they will get them. And so I appreciate when they do that, because a lot of times I don't know where to start, if it's especially an area outside of what I do. But if they recommend a list, I'll go through and try to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest and these people aren't writing together a whole bunch of stuff in the last year, because that would not be a fair shake. But look up those people's bodies of literature and kind of select from there. And I know that as an author, a lot of what I submit these days is outside the box. And I might know of behavior analysts who are doing stuff outside the box that may not be in the quote unquote JABA system. And so I'll make a recommendation, and in your cover letter, you can provide a rationale for why you're making that recommendation. And so the same goes for requesting associate editors as well to handle that paper. Again, it doesn't guarantee you're going to get them. It's just a suggestion, but that is something that authors have the right to do.
Yeah, and I would also encourage authors to do that, right? So Derek's right. Don't list your 4 best friends there, that you've done a lot of work with before and that you're confident would just say really nice things about your paper because they know that you did it. A, that circumvents the review process in ways that we don't want to. And B, the whole point of this, and Derek said this earlier, is the review process is designed to help you produce a better paper. So you want, although it seems so counterintuitive and in the moment feels so counterintuitive when you get reviewer B. So if for folks who aren't familiar with the review process, like just do a quick Google search on like reviewer 2 or reviewer B memes, and like they will all pop up, and they are great. So as much as it stings to get the proverbial reviewer 2 remarks, Derek's right that those remarks often help make your paper a better paper if they're framed critically but constructively, right? Like people should not just be mean as reviewers. They should provide constructive suggestions, but you want folks who are not just going to believe everything that you say, which is kind of an aside. People should say if they think that there are folks out there who would be really good reviewers or really good associate editors, and maybe provide more than one of those, because if the first person isn't available because they've got a really heavy editorial load already, or they have a personal life event where they can't do reviews at this time, it's handy to have more than one. It is also really helpful to have keywords and to be thoughtful about what the keywords are if you're creating an account to be a reviewer, because every system is a little bit different. So like the Wiley system, which is what JABA and JABA are in, is a little bit different from the Springer system, which is where some other behavioral journals are housed. But in almost all of those systems, the system itself will suggest reviewers based on what the author's keyword and what the reviewer has keyworded. And so if there's a good match there between what the author has keyworded in the paper and what the reviewer has keyworded, it helps to increase the likelihood that that particular reviewer would be selected for a paper. The other kind of behind the scenes piece about some of these systems that actually I didn't know until I became an associate editor is that it also shows you all the metrics on that particular reviewer. How likely are they to accept your invitation to review? How late are they in getting that review back to you? And so some of those data also might inform whether, if you get that keyword match or you think somebody would be a really good match based on their existing scholarship, and then you look them up in the system and they decline 90% of their reviews, and the ones that they do are, 100 days late, you are probably going to pass on that particular reviewer, even though the keywords might suggest that they're really good, even though their scholarship might suggest that they're a good fit. So there's some of those pieces that go into it as well.
And in terms of behind the curtain, I would love to say that all reviewers are equally gifted and equally generous with their time that they're putting into the process. But the truth is they're not. And it was definitely one of the things that I'm very considerate of and have been whenever I've handled a paper, is making sure that people are getting a quality experience in the review process, that they're getting reviewers who are going to be comprehensive, who are going to be thoughtful, and who are going to be timely. And recognizing that everybody involved in the review process is doing it as a service, that nobody is really compensated for their time. There are definitely people who I know are consistently going to provide a really high quality, thoughtful review, and trying to not overtax those individuals by always asking them every time I got a paper. But I would love to have John Guerrero's comments, for example, on every paper I ever handled as an AE. It does not matter the topic. He's going to do a phenomenal job, which is probably why he's going to be the next editor of the journal. So congratulations to John and a plug for him. But, especially if I'm going to be sending the paper from a topic area I'm unfamiliar with, or less familiar with, I should say, that I'm going to send to somebody I haven't had a review from before, I'm more likely to also try and balance that out with somebody who I am very familiar with and confident in their work as a reviewer. If I've sent it to somebody who is extremely late or extremely cursory or extremely jerky in their review, I'm probably never going to send you another review if you've committed any of those cardinal sins. So very much the, kind of the machinations of figuring out who am I going to send this to is also trying to balance out quality, trying to get somebody who's a little bit more senior along with people who are a little bit more junior on the panel, giving opportunities to people who are new to the editorial board versus who have been there for a little while, and distributing the workload amongst people and not just, sending everything to Dr. Guerrero, because, it makes it easy for me, but, he gets a little irritated after a while.
Well, yeah, and you don't want to punish people in light of their confidence. I thank you guys for taking a minute to kind of, again, tell us how the sausage is made. I think most of us who are consumers and casual readers of not just JABA, but other publications, and are not in any way, don't produce research, don't review it. It's just fascinating to see how it's like one of those, how it's made shows. It's like it's like went to the shoe factory or something like that. But anyway, I guess one other question I have before, I promise folks that we'll get to the more into the articles themselves, but I just have one more kind of, I guess, meta level question. So we've got a really neat translational paper, and we've got a paper that, although patient outcomes weren't a part of the analysis, it's not too much of an inferential leap to suggest that this this type of procedure could lead to improved patient outcomes as a result of the improvement in these kind of rounding practices. So would these papers, and maybe not these specific papers, but papers like these, when these are submitted, are there sometimes considerations that go to like, hey, maybe JABA is not the right medium for this particular paper? The Gravina paper should maybe go in a nursing journal or something like that, where it might have a wider readership to the people who are actually going to use it. The other paper could go to a physical therapy journal where people could say, "Holy cow! I never knew about this behavior analysis thing," and they might even call it behavior analysis. This gamification of rehab. and it might contact a wider audience. And again, I'm not saying this to, and I know this is the Inside JABA, series, and we want to see a lot of interesting and appropriate articles for that. But I'm also thinking about dissemination, and ultimately how to improve the lives of stakeholders. And I would love to hear your thoughts on when it's appropriate for that dissemination to occur within JABA or behavioral interventions or behavior analysis and practice versus publishing something in a different journal. I don't know who wants to take that first, but I'd love to hear you guys riff on this for a minute or two, or however long it takes to go through it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it's a question that the authors in particular have to go through that process before they ultimately decide to submit. Definitely, is it appropriate for this journal is a big part of what goes into the editorial process. Is, does this fit within the mission of JABA? And there have definitely been submissions of which I've been a part. There's been some submissions of which I've been an author, in which the feedback was, we don't think that this is a great match for JABA, and it might be a better match at these other journals. If it potentially is a match for JABA, but saying, we think you might want to take this elsewhere for your own betterment, I think would be a little bit overly paternalistic, I'd say, of they've already made the judgment call that they feel that this is the best outlet for their work, and if it's acceptable for that source. Now, I will say in terms of dissemination, I think that's less of a concern now than it has been in the past. Like, I'll just say the advent of the internets has made JABA accessible to audiences, and especially the free access to a lot of the things that are in JABA through various sources have made the work accessible to other populations that may find it of interest. So just as a personal example, I've published a few things in JABA related to teaching teachers how to read Braille visually. We're clearly the target population of interest for that is going to be educators of the visually impaired. We decided to submit it to JABA at that time, mostly due to the methodologies and a lot of the teaching strategies being most familiar to a JABA audience. And that has not at all prevented that work from being picked up from those in the visually impaired educational community. Things like Google Scholar will send email notifications of like, oh, this was cited here, here, and here. And it's all the journals that I may have wanted to have submitted that to for other reasons. They all seem to have read it regardless of the fact that it was published in JABA.
Now, does that in turn change your submission decisions moving forward, Jeff? In other words, would you be more likely to publish in a, if you're, I don't know if you're still involved in this line of research, but let's just say for the argument that you are, would you be, based on that feedback from the Google alerts, et cetera, would you be more likely to submit to another journal where it's going to contact perhaps more stakeholders in that particular area of disability? I know I'm putting you on the spot here, so
no. It's with every journal, you kind of have to understand what their mission and their purpose and what type of work are they supporting and what are the metrics they're using to decide if it's a good fit for their journal or not. So I try with to develop a study if there's a particular question that I think is important to answer and the appropriate methods to answer that question. And then what is the appropriate outlet to disseminate that and who's most likely to pick this up in a useful way and run with it. So if, the use of things like single subject methodology is one of those cut points, we'll say, is that there are particular questions in development in the early stages of technologies and treatment development that evaluating within subjects to understand your effects is the most appropriate step, and JABA is going to be the most receptive audience to those types of studies. When it comes to broader application, more actuarial or population level of grade at work for 3 kids, how's it going to work if we apply this to a classroom? What percentage of kids are going to be sensitive to this? those methodologies, those ones that a journal like Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness, for example, is going to be more receptive to. Training actual teachers as opposed to undergraduate students to engage in these skills is something that they're going to be much more receptive to. So in a lot of ways, I would kind of categorize what I was referring to as that proof of concept, similar to the Vaidya paper, is does it, as a starting point, could we make something like this work? And JABA being a really appropriate ground for those types of studies. And then the larger questions that we'd hopefully all get to, perhaps being more appropriate for those other journals.
Okay.
And just one last point is you've made the concern before is the readership of JABA exclusively going to be the autism and DD world? And if we're only submitting our autism and DD work to JABA and anything that involves the out of the box, we're going to submit to other journals, we're creating the JABA box if we're doing that.
Yeah,
I have just a couple of follow-ups on that. One is that I agree with Jeff. It's really the author's purview to decide who they want the audience to be and what they want the outlet to be. So I wouldn't, if something fit within the scope and mission of the journal, and I thought that it would have a really big splash, like these are both healthcare papers, right? Are they going to have a really big splash or a bigger effect in an OT or a PT or a nursing journal? I wouldn't reject the paper from the outlet to which the authors had submitted it if it fit in that outlet, because I thought that it might have a big splash in another outlet. But I think there is a role for helping to get that paper more widely disseminated. Jeff is right that the dissemination is much easier now than it used to be, but I think that there are features of papers that make them more or less palatable to audiences outside of behavior analysis. So one of those is, are you using terms the way that collaborators in other disciplines would use those terms? And so I think it's really notable, for example, that the Gravina et al. Paper, they had collaborators who were working within the hospital, who were the physicians, who were the nurses, who could help them incorporate the terminology from that discipline so that when a reader outside of behavior analysis picks it up, it's not just full of behavior analysis jargon, it's actually consumable to those audiences. And a second related piece to that is, are you citing literature from those other disciplines and from those other journals? Because it will show up on those authors' Google alerts that says, hey, someone just cited your paper. And what a great way to get behavior analysis out in front of the eyes of people in another discipline is to publish a paper where you're saying something positive, you're expanding on something that they've done in a way that they might not have thought to or been trained to do it. And I think that's a really nice dissemination point that we can make that might take a paper that has this broad appeal and really make sure that it gets in front of the folks outside of the direct JABA audience or the audience for that particular journal, whoever it might be, who would pick up the paper because it's published in this particular outlet and they get alerts for that outlet, right? So I think that as part of the editorial process, one of the things that we can do, if authors haven't already put in some of that legwork, is help to facilitate getting those papers ready so that they have that splash outside of the primary readership of the journal. A second piece of that, though, is related to readership. So journals have different readerships. Different journals are going to go to different audiences. So I think if you're an author and you're thinking about publishing something yourself, it is useful to think about who you want that readership to be. Are you writing this for nurses? If so, it should go to a nursing journal, and you need to make sure that you're following their conventions, that you have the statistical analyses that they're probably expecting in those outlets, that you are talking, you're not just saying we used a concurrent multiple baseline design, but you're really talking about like what that means and what that is, and its repeated measures, and this is where the control is, in ways that you wouldn't write if you were probably publishing primarily for a behavior analyst readership, because they know what a multiple baseline is and they have an understanding of repeated measures across time and why there's control there and how it's a valid experiment. So the foundation of your paper and the way that you write it is going to be shaped a lot by the audience that you want to read it. Now, this gets really challenging when you have papers like the 2 papers that we're talking about today that have multiple audiences and multiple readerships. And I think it takes a lot of author savvy to be able to write for multiple audiences who are going to understand your paper and be able to apply the concepts in your paper in meaningful ways. So that's, I just think, something to consider both from the author side and from the peer review side.
Can I jump in with something? I know we need to move on, but
No. Well,
but
I think it's worthwhile spending some time on this because these are really keys to dissemination that I think are really important. So I think we should take as much time as
cool.
need be on this. So
I'm probably one of the biggest proponents of publishing outside the box and trying to disseminate behavior analysis. I'm all about that. But I strongly encourage at least new behavior analysts and new faculty to not do that. And rationale being, work like the ones that we're talking about today, like this is a beginning of a line of research. And so putting that in your home journal validates it in some way. It puts the stamp of approval that, yes, this other field called applied behavior analysis thought this was worthy enough to publish. So down the road, when these authors do decide to publish for those other journals, they can submit that. And then when these reviewers who are not behavior analysts start to read these, what we do, we Google Scholar people, you look them up and try to figure out, like, is this legit? And I've seen papers come into JABA that I get assigned, and they're not by behavior analysts. And so one of the first things I'll do is look up and see, have they published on this elsewhere? Like, is this like a thing? Is this like a known line of research in their discipline? And now they're trying to move it into behavior analysis, because that's going to be very different in terms of how I handle that paper and how I think about it. And I just worry sometimes, and I've seen it happen when I've reviewed for non-behavior analytic journals, is that sometimes behavior analysts try to basically like crusade and get behavior analysis into something in a very forceful way.
No, come on. Are you, stop it. Really?
Yeah. Can you believe that? But what happens though, is that if it's not done in a very tactful, elegant way, in a very, careful way, that can burn bridges for behavior analysis, because this might be a journal's first taste of behavior analysis. And if it's someone basically trashing that line of work, like that journal, basically saying, hey, we have a better way to do this with our multiple baselines and your stats are awful, so here, we're going to educate you. Another behavior analyst will probably never be able to publish in that journal because they just shut the door. And so I encourage people to submit stuff to JABA to get that expertise, to get that endorsement of our field before they start to take their translational work outside of our field. And maybe that's not a popular opinion, but I think it's incredibly important. So it looks like Claire has something to say.
I think I would have slightly different advice. Not that I disagree with you, but I think that a useful path is less, for me, has been less about seniority and how established you are, and more, I think, fundamentally about being a good collaborator, right? So it's not like you necessarily have to have 50 publications in an area before you step out and you publish in a more mainstream, like broader non-behavior analysis journal. But are you being a good collaborator? Are you being a good interdisciplinarian where you are not being a jerk? So this could be like the theme, Matt, for the episode, like how to not be a jerk or why to not be a jerk as a behavior analyst. Jeff doesn't like jerk reviewers. We don't like jerk AEs. We don't like jerks as collaborators.
In fairness, as long as we cover when to be a jerk, so we get both sides. No, I'm just kidding.
I think that if you're being a good interdisciplinarian, so you're participating on an interdisciplinary or collaborative team where you're not being the person who walks in and says, it looks like everything that you're doing is wrong. Let me show you how you can be a better person, right? Like that is the jerk approach. But if you instead say, you're doing something really interesting, like having good rounds in the case of the Gravina paper, right? Like having good rounds improves patient outcomes. And this is really important. How can we help you do that? Like talk to us. One of the really nice things about this paper is they start with like, talk to us about what your procedures are, how you've already established them. What are the pinch points for you?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you able, like one of my favorite questions in collaboration when we're trying to get something new going is like, why isn't this happening already? Right? Like, why aren't you doing these great rounds already? And the nurses say like, well, I'm delivering meds while you're trying to do rounds. Of course I can't do rounds. And then saying like, oh, okay. So how can we help you with those things? And I think that approach is the way also to get work published as a more junior scholar or in a newer area, is because you are not the lead on this paper. You are bringing a particular perspective to an interdisciplinary team and working with an author who is well published in this particular area or in this outlet. And so they know how to write for that audience. And you can bring a behavior analytic perspective to that to improve the quality of what is already a high quality product or a well-functioning team. So just an alternative way that you might approach that.
And I'll just say, I thought, Derek, you were actually going to go in a little bit of a different direction with your advice, but I thought it was great is for the person just starting out. And let's just say that you're trying to do something new where you don't have the benefit of more established collaborators, is that when you're trying to go into a new area, it is entering a different culture with different expectations that you're not familiar with, and you're probably going to trip over yourself in some way. Or said another way, you're probably not going to be successful at the first go. You're going to get some feedback and you're going to get better at it if it's a good process. And that as a new researcher, particularly if it's somebody who's going into academia, having some successful outcomes early on is really critical to your opportunity to continue to have those outcomes. Al Poling wrote a research book with some collaborators, and I loved his first chapter because it was the most pragmatic advice for new researchers I ever came across. And it was the idea of, at the start of your career, don't be risk adverse. Like take on projects that are going to have a successful outcome, that are going to establish your bona fides and your credentials as a researcher, so you get to keep your job. And as you've got a little bit of foundation, you can diversify, you can take some bigger risks. And it was very much of like, have some safe investments before you go gambling. And in a lot of ways, due to the I don't know, and I'm not sure how this is going to be received by this outside culture, that is a big risk. It could have a big reward, but if you're at the early stages of your career and that doesn't go well, you may not continue to have that career. So just realistic, pragmatic advice, a good reason to stay close to home, at least early on, if you don't have the seasoned collaborators to lean on, as Claire suggested.
Excellent. Well, guys, I think the last 15 minutes, I think is probably, if people don't listen to any other part of this podcast, I think that is probably like as far as a masterclass on academic dissemination outside of behavior analysis, that you guys really provided some solid advice to people who are doing research and interested in making an impact both within and outside of behavior analysis. So I appreciate the varying perspectives on how to do that. It's really helpful. So I have to confess, I had to corral my dog, so he didn't join us on the podcast while Derek was giving a rundown of the papers, and Derek was not my dog. Derek was, I think you'd started with one, and by the time I got back into the podcasting chair, you were talking about the other one. So I do want to return to the actual papers themselves. They're just not prompts for talking about internecine publishing minutia or disagreements or what have you. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time going over the papers themselves. So I am open to how we want to proceed doing this. So why don't we start with the translational one? Derek, I don't know if you got to talk about, I think you said it is a translational paper and you listed off the reasons why. Do you want to talk more about what makes this a translational paper, or what makes a translational paper a translational paper? It's not just applying the matching law to some, everyday walk of life phenomenon, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah, happy to opine on this. So translational research means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And you'll hear varying perspectives of, there's basic research, there's applied research, anything in between, therefore, must be translational research. And that may be true for some people, but that's not the way I think about it. So NIH, the National Institutes of Health, they actually have two kind of forms of translational research. So there's type 1, which is like your bench to bedside preclinical translation. And that's what I think of when we think of translational work in JABA, for example. So taking something from JAB, from the pages of JAB, and then just providing like some iteration of that with an eye towards application. So you can vary lots of different things in a study. You can vary the setting, the participant, the operant, the consequence, the change agent. And so if you're using the natural version of all of those, that's applied research. But once you start like substituting one out because of control purposes or simulating something with like a computer program to proxy a teacher, things like that, that then is an eye towards translation. That, in my opinion, is translational research. There's another form of translational research, which is type 2 translational research, and that is packaging things for scale. So getting foundational information to population community levels in an effectiveness sort of standpoint, making it feasible, cost effective, et cetera. So that's another form of translation. In behavior analysis, I think we talk about type 1 quite a bit, which is basically human operant sort of work. And that's kind of what we think of with translational work. So with the Vedia and Armshaw, what I thought was neat with this is that they had a technology that is what would be used in the real world. They had basically a computer program that could be used in the real world for the real setting, but it was not the real setting. This was, when you read the paper, they basically conducted research in several different convenient locations. These were undergraduate students who were healthy. They had no problems with their knees. So generality suffers a little bit with that, but you have to start somewhere, and you have to make sure that, as you're translating this idea, that you're controlling for everything else. And so like if the issue here is, does this software and this device work, then we need to make sure that we're not throwing all sorts of other variables into it, like age of the participants or the health of the participants. Just control for all of that with healthy undergraduates. And now we're isolating the question to the device. And so that's where I think this falls squarely with the translational side, is that it's translating in some ways technology, but they're also translating from a basic principle side, some stuff from extinction, which we'll talk about in a minute, which I thought was a really cool piece of this. And then just contingency management sort of stuff. So having the gamification with the changing criterion and all that sort of stuff, and earning points, and using the computer software to do that. So one of the things that they did that was really neat was they needed to create a threshold for their target for how much flexing has to happen in your knee for you to basically earn the points and earn the reinforcer. And so what they did was almost like a changing criterion design, where they kept upping the ante in terms of how much impulse they needed to detect. And they would provide an auditory feedback, like a reinforcer. And so they got it up to a certain point. And then when they went to the next level, they put that on extinction, but they didn't tell the participants that. And so what they were trying to do is essentially program an extinction burst. And that by doing that, they were evoking the participants' maximum flexing of their knee. And so that was more than they would have done with just the changing criterion. And so then they found that point of that kind of extinction burst, and then they took 75% of that as the threshold for then the gamification side. So again, I think that's where some of the translation happens. Medical researchers who would have been doing this would not have thought to do that. So this is a squarely cool operant sort of approach. So I'd be interested to hear what other people thought about some of the procedures and how they could conceptualize this as translation.
Yeah, and I think there's a valuable discussion of as a researcher, when you're designing a study, where your interest is in clinical application is when, for what reasons might you set it up in a more translational manner? And one of the things you said, Derek, was that it may be that it gives you some more control over your experimental variables, and that's definitely one factor. But another one is that if you're going to be exposing patients, clients, participants, whatever it is to this, is what is the risk of harm to those individuals? So this is a situation where people have just, for the clinical population, these folks have just had knee surgery. I'm not a physician to know exactly how stable that is, but you're asking them to engage in a behavior that's historically painful and uncomfortable. We have no idea if this is going to work to their betterment. And I don't know what level of beyond discomfort, like, is there actual risk to their knee from doing this? I'm not suggesting there is. I legitimately don't know. But a reason for setting this up with a healthy population was, in a lot of ways, is, does this measurement work? Is it able to capture different levels of engagement and flexion? And are these contingencies capable of changing behavior and doing it with a population with whom the initial ask doesn't pose any risk? And I thought for that, it was an incredibly appropriate and a good model for when to move into a translational model, because doing it with the population of interest may be putting them at undue risk of harm before we have evidence that this is even potentially effective. Now that they've seen it's potentially effective, the opportunity to replicate this with the clinically relevant population seems much more appropriate to me.
And that's exactly the reason why I think I've been historically such an advocate in my own work and others for translational approaches to issues like procedural fidelity and integrity. Right? If we're deliberately degrading interventions and exposing people to things, to environmental situations that may be detrimental over sometimes a relatively long period of time, if we're talking about parametric studies, I think that's another avenue, just like Jeff suggested, where we might be able to pull things back into the lab in what some people, including some scholars at the NIH, have called reverse translation. So Derek mentioned bench to bedside, and reverse translation is where you go bedside to bench, right? There's something out in the world, there's a problem that we want to solve, and we can mock pieces of it up in a more controlled situation or with a less risky population. But I'm really interested in everybody's take on where translational research kind of fits in the broader discipline. And because I think a lot of the listeners to behavioral observations are practitioners, like, to what extent should practitioners care about translational research? Should they pick it up and read it? Is it valuable to them? Or do they need to wait until we get those replication and follow-up studies to really say, like, yeah, that I'm gonna, this was neat, I'm gonna wait for the follow-up one. What is your take on that?
I think one of the questions that's important with that is, why are we asking it in a translational model to begin with? And I'm not a big fan of, and this is what the founders said, but one of the characteristics of applied behavior analysis, as laid out in Bearwolf and Risley, was, in the very first one in applied, is that we're not going to work with convenient samples. We're not going to just work with college freshmen because they're easy to get, but we're going to evaluate our procedures with those for whom they're most relevant. And I'm not, to the extreme, particularly with JABA, that everything needs to have immediate clinical application. I'm a big fan of a lot of translational work, but asking the question of, why are we translating it? Why aren't we doing it directly with the population of interest? And if the answer is it's for our own convenience, that's a really bad answer. If it's for the purposes of enhanced experimental control, that's a good answer. If it's to not risk harm to our patients and our clients, that's an even better answer. So I some people who tag themselves as a translational researcher of, I'm going to do it in this model because it's cool, sometimes run the risk of answering questions that are cool to them, but aren't going to expand our understanding of science enough to be of interest to our basic researchers, and are going to be detached from an applied question that's going to make it interesting and important to our applied researchers. So within the question of, like, as a clinician, should you be really interested in this? I think, yes, of course, read everything. Why not? is it addressing something that you need to know the answer to for your practice, but for whatever reason can't do that? Whether it's safety or feasibility or whatever it might be. That'd be my take.
So I'll chime in. I constantly have to fight for why I consider my research applied, and it gets frustrating. And what I think is interesting is Beowulf and Risley is interpreted so different by everyone. And so, Jeff commented on what you could take from that paper, but one of the first sentences when they talk about applied is that it's not determined by the research procedures used, but by the interest with which society puts onto that topic. And so I think that's where, if you're having to sacrifice precision for the sake of advancing the research, that's where I think behavior analysis is okay with that. Because, for example, as we were discussing with the Vaidya paper, it would be inappropriate to just try new stuff with a clinical sample that is put at risk. And so I think Beowulf and Risley, I'm not going to pretend I know what they would have thought, but they would be okay to this translational effort because we'd at least want to be doing the research and not letting someone else, take over it because we can't get it into a very clean operant standpoint. With respect to why practitioners need to know about this stuff, there's a great paper I assigned to all my undergraduates, 2011 Murray Sidman paper, Can an Understanding of Basic Research Facilitate the Effectiveness of Practitioners, Reflections, and Personal Perspectives? And the idea that he kind of lays forth in that paper is that you will encounter things in practice that you were not expecting, and you then don't know what to do. And if you're a BCBA, you are the end of the line for that clinical path for that client. So it is imperative for you then to be able to go back to principles and behavioral mechanisms and figure out where you can expand and what literature you can then sink your teeth into. Translational research translates in a way. So it takes some of these ideas and pulls it back and puts them into kind of basic behavioral mechanisms and processes, and kind of highlights what is operating that makes this stuff work. Like, what's the active treatment ingredient? We can use translational research and kind of what Claire said with the reverse translation, answer that question. And then you can determine, how we can leverage that or harness that behavioral principle to then solve the issue at hand. And so that's why I think practitioners should pay attention to this stuff, because it might provide a roadmap for making sense of clinical issues they might encounter in their work.
I will momentarily hop on a training soapbox, and then I promise I will hop back down. But that training soapbox is we also need to be doing a good job preparing practitioners to consume research that is heavily grounded in principles and to be able to work with those principles in a flexible enough way that they can take something, see the principles in it, and develop a new application because of it. And I am not sure that as a field, we are uniformly doing a great job of that. And I think that we are putting our new practitioners, and probably even some of our more senior practitioners, at a disadvantage if they don't have the skill set and they weren't well prepared to be able to consume research and develop new procedures based on principle. And I'll hop off my soapbox.
It's the idea that we're never going to be able to prepare people for everything that they see, and it's, can you teach decision making? Can you analyze available data and use that? Like, we should always be evidence based. We should always find what's in the literature demonstrated to be effective, but being able to tie that to the uniqueness of exactly what you're seeing in practice that's the art form, right? And as a trainer, that's the really hard part that we work really hard to try and teach people. What's the process? We don't know what the answer is, but we know the process. And we know the questions to ask to help us arrive there, and trust in the process is something I feel like I say on a very, very regular basis with my people.
And it helps, I think, prevent becoming dogmatic too, or rigid in your application of things, where like, I always do exactly this thing. And then when that doesn't work, it's hard to figure out what to do next. And so I think that reading widely, to loop this back to my original question, but like reading broadly and widely is useful.
I would just add a couple of quick points to at least to address the question of why practitioners who aren't involved in research, should care about this stuff. And I think one is that it's just exposure and variability, and so, I guess for me, I find this stuff just interesting to see other applications, while at the same time, Jeff, going back to the point you made a while back, certainly not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, we gotta stop with all this ASD stuff and go down all these other novel applications. It's not a yeah but, it's a yes and. I think another thing too is that with folks who might start out in a more traditional role as a behavior analyst and have these maybe have other professional interests or maybe other personal interests that they want to merge with behavior analysis. We're seeing this a lot in the area of wellness. So I've had a number of people on the show to talk about, how they're, coaching people with either with fitness or other types of, sports related stuff. So there's quite a number of behavior analysts who are involved in that, and that's growing. And I'm blanking on yet, there's probably many other applications where we could talk about where people might see the intersection of these sorts of things. So I think these, some of these, applied and translational stuff are inspirational for those who might, have an itch to scratch outside of the DD world. Moving on here. I want to just ask if there's anything we want to wrap up about the Vaidya paper, or do we want to move on and comment on the Gravina et al. One? I know we kind of talked, we used the Gravina paper as a vehicle to talk about some of the other, I guess, review aspects and whatnot. So, but if there were other thoughts about that paper that you want to get in before we wrap up this episode, I want to give you guys the opportunity to comment on it.
I have just a couple of things. Number one, I think it's important to note in their author note that they thank the developer of the app. So they were in contact with them. They thank an MD who helped advise on the project. So this wasn't exactly them just deciding to do some biomedical research on a whim. Like, this was very systematic and done in consultation with appropriate people. And number two, it kind of speaks to something that prior to this call, I think Jeff raised, which is we have to be careful about not going outside our areas of competency. And keeping in mind, translational research, you kind of have some affordability to do that because you're not necessarily saying that you're helping someone. But the second that you start to do something, like if they were applying this as actual treatment for people who just got out of surgery, it would probably be inappropriate to not have an MD listed as an author on the paper and advising every aspect of this. So I don't want people walking away thinking, oh, translational research, I can just go start doing whatever I want and it's fun and cool and interesting. You definitely have to stay within your area of competency and thinking about, are you working with clients? Or are you working with just convenient research participants? And that's where the ethical boundaries kind of start to lie.
Yeah, if nobody listening to this should be like, oh, my mom just had knee replacement surgery. Mom, I got you this app and the sensor. We're going to do some exercises. That'd probably be a bad idea.
Right. Or, if they're visiting a relative in the hospital, say, hey guys, next time you do rounds, I got a great idea. Hear me out.
I will say, even in the bounds of translational research, if you are doing things that might involve risk to your nominal convenience sample, it is really important to have collaborators on board who can help to mitigate that risk. So we are doing a study right now. I'm collaborating with one of the other faculty members here, Katie Kessner, on a study on relapse in physical activity. So we are like putting people on treadmills and reinforcing going on treadmills and then seeing what happens when we discontinue reinforcers as a model of workplace incentives. And it's a translational study, right? It's a relapse study. They're a convenient sample, but we darn well have a nurse who's there for every session because we are putting people on treadmills. And we want to make sure that we're not doing something if we were to get some form of an extinction burst where they are like running themselves and they pass out. Like the fact that it's a translational study doesn't mean that we can remove those safety checks and balances, and that it's like okay to put them at risk because they're a convenient sample. So I think all of those, you always have to be weighing the risks and benefits of your research and making sure that you're mitigating the risks as much as you can within the context of any study, applied or translational, or even basic research, right? Like we want to make sure that with our animal research that we're providing quality care and housing for the animals. So that's the case across every kind of research that you can think of.
All right, very good. Unless there are any other kind of final thoughts, I just want to say thanks to you guys for giving this topic a thorough and vigorous discussion. I know I certainly learned a lot about the review process and the considerations and things like that. Really fascinating stuff to me. And again, a lot of great points about how to branch out appropriately without being the ugly behaviorist. So I think, if people don't listen to any other part of this show, they should listen to that section of the episode. So lots of good stuff here, guys. So thanks so much for joining me in this Inside JABA series. Hey, everyone, want to jump in here real quick and just say thanks to my Inside JABA series colleagues, including Dr. Linda LeBlanc, who assigned these papers. Really enjoyed going over them. Big thanks to Derek for joining us as well and talking about the AE process. I just want to jump in here again real quick to remind you that these Inside JABA Series podcasts are available for CEUs, and you can find out how to obtain them at the show notes for this episode. So head over to behavioralobservations.com, look for the show notes for this particular episode, or the easier way to do it is actually just go to behavioralobservations.com and click on Get CEUs. At the same time, we really want to support outlets like JABA. And as I mentioned at the introduction of this show, the subscription fee for JABA is really cheap, especially in consideration to other journals that are out there. So please consider supporting JABA with your subscription. You can find out how to do that, again, at the show notes for this episode. I'll have a link that takes you to the Wiley publishing page where you can select a subscription, tier or process or whatever you want to call it. Whatever works for you. I think there's both print and online versions, so check it out there. And again, you can find all that information over at behavioralobservations.com. All right, we will see you in session 171. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.